tickets for this? You know, I don't know.
Underings come free.
Secretary of State, good morning. Thank you very much for appearing before the Select Committee today. We have a number of areas we'd like to probe with you, and then in the last hour or 45 minutes, inspired by 5,000 tweets in the end, so thank you to Twitter, following the hashtag #AskGove. We've had huge public engagement, an awful lot of questions on a whole variety of issues. And throughout the session, I would appeal to my colleagues on here particularly, and also to you, Secretary of State, to try and keep questions and answers short and pithy. We may not always manage the 140 characters of Twitter, but if we can try and follow that to an extent, we can cover more ground and hear from you on a whole variety of subjects. If I may, Secretary of State, I'd like to begin with the accountability system in schools. And of course, we've got news this morning about changes in the equivalence, so an awful lot of qualifications, vocational qualifications, are no longer going to count towards GCSEs. Can you tell us your vision for the accountability system in schools going forward? Do you think it's fit for purpose now? If not, how would you like it to change?
I think it's better than it was, but I think that we have to keep it constantly under review, because we all know that whenever you have any measurement that is then used as an accountability measurement, and in effect a target, that there's always a temptation to game the system. And we know that that's happened in all areas of public sector reform. So what we've sought to do is to try to balance a variety of things. On the one hand, we've tried to have an element of consistency in the most important measure, the anchor measure, which is 5 A stars to C's, including English and maths. I think because schools know that that is a measure against which they will be measured, and if they fall below it, then they will be held directly accountable, that acts as a spur to overall improvement for every student. But we've also sought more recently to try to add some additional nuances to that, partly influenced by the work of this committee and by you, Mr. Chairman. So in this year's league tables, just published the other week, we've included, for example, data on the performance of children who had low prior attainment, broadly average or on track prior attainment, and higher prior attainment. And there's more as well that we can do as we look at achievement in particular areas, and again as we adopt one of the arguments that you've made about making sure that there's a measure which looks at the performance across the best 8 GCSEs.
Thank you for that. So you described the current situation. Going forward, do you think we need a more balanced scorecard? Because when the Minister of Schools came here talking about the English Baccalaureate, he was keen to emphasise it wasn't an accountability measure.
Yes.
And so in truth, the additional information, which is extremely welcome, it does not really count towards accountability. And we still have, I would suggest, interested to hear your response, the anchor measure, that one metric, driving behaviour in secondary schools.
Yes.
Which the committee view, I think, broadly is that having that one metric leads to a non-balanced scorecard, and therefore has perverse outcomes, and we need a more balanced scorecard. And we wonder if you could agree with that, and if so, could point us where you might go in future.
Up to a point. I think it's important to recognise that we've refined the 5 A star to C measure so that when it comes to accountability to the Department for Education, it's not only the case that you've got to clear that hurdle, it's also the case that we take into account whether or not pupils are making the expected level of progress. And if it is the case that your students are exceeding the expected levels of progress, in other words, you're above average for getting children to do better than might otherwise have been anticipated, you'll evade being below the floor. So in that sense, I think that we've already refined that measure. But I think it's important... Would
you accept that's a very small refinement?
I accept that it's, I wouldn't say very small. I think it's significant because it sends a very powerful signal that we expect schools not only to be judged on the level of raw attainment, but also in terms of making sure that children are on track and are not falling back and indeed do better than the average.
So how many schools are below the floor How many failed to get 35% 5 good GCSEs this year?
It was just over 100. I think it was down from, I think I've got the figures here, but I think it was down from over 200 to just over 100.
So it was 111, I think.
Yes.
And how many schools that failed to get 35% GCSEs didn't trigger potential intervention because of the progression of their pupils?
I don't know.
It was 4, Secretary of State. So I'd suggest it was not significant. It's pretty small. And in truth, if you have a low-performing cohort from Key Stage 2 primary, then on average, low-performing pupils do not make the same progression as middle and higher attaining pupils. So you're actually setting an amelioration, if that's the right word, that doesn't have much effect in reality.
That's one point of view. I would argue that what it does is that it suggests that the original measure reinforces a point that I would argue, which is that schools that aren't generating high levels of attainment are generally schools which are not doing well. There will always be exceptions to every rule. And the fact that 4 out of 111, or just over 3% of schools, are in that category shows that it does add value for individual schools, because for any individual school, falling below the floor is a very serious point. But what it reinforces is that this measure is catching not only those schools that are underperforming in terms of attainment, but also those schools that are failing to meet the expected level of progress. But I would add something else as well. Under the last government, accountability was all about accountability upwards, either to the local authority or to the department. We believe that accountability should also be downwards to the community and to individual parents. And that's why we've published far more data than ever before about the performance of schools. And that allows you, Mr. Chairman, to make that particular comparison. But there are an infinite number of ways in which the data can be sliced and diced, which would allow people to make judgments about which schools are performing well or badly, and then to ask why we're not ensuring that those schools which are performing well have their performance emulated elsewhere, and those schools that are performing badly, we can focus our attention on and help them to do better.
Okay, thank you. The Minister for Schools has said that closing the attainment gap between rich and poor is, I quote, a key objective of the government. Where does closing the gap rate in your list of priorities?
I think there are two things that we need to do in education, and the first is that we need to raise standards overall for all children, and the second thing is that we need to close the gap between those children who come from poorer backgrounds and those who are fortunate enough to grow up in more comfortable backgrounds. So the two are the two principal drivers of education reform.
And the central accountability driver is the 5 good GCSEs, as you've just laid out for us. How does the focus on the 5 good GCSEs measure contribute to closing the gap between rich and poor students?
Well, I think that every child should expect that they should leave school with at least a C pass in English and mathematics. And I think that more than that, we should be significantly more ambitious and making sure that more and more children, for example, get the qualifications in the English baccalaureate, which enable them to go on to the college or university course of their choice, or the job or apprenticeship that will be satisfying. So you're quite right to say that there is one central accountability measure, and as we've already discussed, that central accountability measure helps identify those schools in the most difficult circumstances. But overall, when it comes to improving attainment for children who come from poorer backgrounds, as well as that accountability measure, and as well as the English baccalaureate, we're also publishing the performance of children, both, as we discussed, who have low prior attainment, and children who are eligible for the Pupil premium, and we're asking schools to report on how they use the Pupil premium, and we're also going to ask Ofsted to investigate how the Pupil premium has been used in order to drive up standards, and we've asked the Education Endowment Foundation that we've set up to pilot and to let us know ways in which individual schools or groups of schools are helping children from disadvantaged backgrounds.
I totally appreciate that, and I appreciate, as the committee does, I'm sure, that your aim is to close the gap. The thing we're interested in, particularly this morning, is whether the drivers within the system actually align with that. And if the focus, if there is an overriding focus on getting the percentage of children with 5 good GCSEs up above a floor, then that incentivises schools, as I think the government's admitted, to focus resources on those students on the borderline. And that means necessarily that you are ignoring those with the lowest prior attainment and those who have little or no likelihood of getting the 5 good GCSEs. And that all too often means neglecting the poorest, the people who you've said it's a top priority of government to help? Do we not have an incoherence between the goals of the system, which is to close the gap, and the drivers of the system, which are to focus on the borderline and, for the most part, better off students to get them over the line so that they get 5 good GCSEs?
No. I mean, I think your question begs a variety of other questions, or provokes them perhaps. And central to your question is, I think, an unexamined hypothesis, which I would contest, which is that there are children who can't get 5 A to C, including English and maths. Show me these children. There are schools which are capable of getting nearly every child to that level. I think it is unacceptable that we should write children off at any stage and say that they cannot secure a C pass in English or maths or other GCSEs. Are we saying that after 11 years in compulsory state education that we should accept, as we are, unfortunately having to live with at the moment, a situation where there are children leaving illiterate and innumerate? Of course it's the case that if a school can't get the majority of its children to that point, that school is not doing well enough. And I think that actually we've acquiesced in failure, and we have let down the children who are quite rightly your first concern by saying that it's okay to judge a school as, decent if it's not getting that level of attainment. The other thing is that the majority of schools which are below the floor and the majority of schools which are underperforming are in areas of deprivation. It's also the case that this government has extended the use of floor standards and floor targets to primary schools, which the last government didn't do, and as a result we're tackling underperformance earlier. It's the case that we've already got a significant number of primary schools which are below the floor target, which have been converted to academies. There are others, including some in some London suburbs, that we're choosing to tackle. We're accused of having, on the one hand, a strong arm approach towards these schools, and on the other hand, a neglectful approach towards those children who are disadvantaged. Well, our critics, they can have it both ways, they always do, but our critics cannot maintain intellectual consistency in that regard.
So are you, by the end of this Parliament, going to transform the number of children who, when they don't get level 4 at primary school, do get 5 good GCSEs? Because at the moment, from the tables you produced a couple of days ago,
yes.
Those children who don't get level 4 have a very small chance of getting 5 good GCSEs.
Yes.
And you have the magic wand that is going to lift those children up. Simply demanding it from schools is going to do it, is it?
We don't have a magic wand, but what we do have are a range of policies working in partnership with teachers and other professionals in the education system. I've alluded to some of them earlier. A sharper focus on underperformance at primary level, an extension of the academies programme, the establishment of teaching schools, investment in extending the number of national leaders of education, an expansion in Teach First nationwide, driving up the standards of entry into the teaching profession, paying bursaries to get high-performing mathematics and physics and other science graduates into teaching, making sure that there are maths specialists in primary schools in order to ensure, in particular, that performance in that critical subject improves for children up to the age of 11, and the accountability measures that we have at primary and secondary, and the publication of additional data, and the light that we're shining on underperformance is part of it. It's also the case that we're making it clear that the national curriculum has to be focused on the acquisition of core knowledge and appropriate skills. It's also the case that we're reforming the examination system, and we've already reformed Key Stage 2 tests in order to make sure that there is a sharper focus on raising standards.
We had a Twitter question, which I thought came to the heart of this very well. Is there any evidence that it's possible to overcome normal distribution in educational attainment?
Bell curve. I think that there's a tendency for people to believe that because the normal distribution curve, the bell curve, has described educational attainment in the past, that those who fall on either part of the bell curve are those who are always destined to stay there. I don't know whether or not you can shift normal distribution, but I do know two things. I know that the Flynn effect shows that children are becoming cleverer over time, and therefore we should continue to expect more of them. I also know that international evidence shows that in other countries you do not have the same relationship between deprivation and educational destiny as we do in this country. This country is not quite uniquely, but almost uniquely scarred by the fact that children from poorer backgrounds do less well.
Could it be the drivers in the system that are doing it? I mean, the last government had the floor. The last government put 5 good GCSEs, and the last government saw us drop down the PISA comparison tables, which the most frequently quoted fact that you use. and yet your response is to reinforce the focus on that anchor measure. In fact, to show additional machismo and commitment is to raise the floor higher at the same time as making it harder to get there, thus pressuring schools even more to game the system rather than focus on the poorest and weakest who are likely never to count.
Well, again, I would challenge three of the assertions that you've made there. Firstly, have floor standards played no part in school improvement? I think they've been integral to school improvement. And I'm happy to criticise the last government, but I'm also delighted to be able to praise them. And floor standards were right. They were an integral part of the success of the various challenge programmes. We are, let's, as well as concentrating on our weaknesses, acknowledge our strengths. We are unique amongst advanced industrial nations in having a capital city that outperforms the national average in terms of educational attainment. London schools are better. And one of the reasons for that is that floor standards were an integral part of the London Challenge right from the beginning. So let's not diss floor standards. They're integral to raising expectations. Then the second point is, if we look precisely internationally, we can see that it's a mixture of autonomy at the level of principal or head teacher plus rigorous external accountability that are the best drivers of raising standards. And then the third point, deprivation, children being neglected, the system being gamed. Everything that we have done has been to ensure that the system isn't gamed. And the announcement that you very kindly alluded to earlier today, which follows on from Professor Alison Wolf's report, is precisely about tackling one of the things that the last government did wrongly, which was allowing qualifications to be taken, which inflated league table rankings, allowed students, therefore, to leave school with qualifications that would not allow them to progress into good jobs or satisfying courses. So my approach is to be led by the evidence, and the evidence tells me that there are some things that the last government did which are right and will continue, and some things they did wrong which will ditch.
One last question from me, Secretary of State. You're disapplying the ICT curriculum, leaving schools free to choose whether to teach it as a discrete subject at all. How will you incentivise schools to offer the rigorous computer science, which I know you wish to see, when league tables may incentivise them not to?
Well, two things. Firstly, it will be the case that ICT remains part of the national curriculum. So schools can't say, we're not offering the subject. But everyone told us that the existing ICT curriculum was demotivating. I think an incentive anyway will be to ensure that children are motivated by a subject which is part of the national curriculum. So schools will want to adopt courses, and good teachers will adopt courses which are better equipped to give children the satisfying and stimulating diet that they yearn for. But I'd add one other thing. I'm in favour of floor standards, and I'm in favour of intervening where schools are underperforming. But I also think it's right to say that while we want to tackle gaming and make sure that we tackle perverse incentives in the system, let's not assume that the behaviour of all teachers and all head teachers is driven only by external accountability factors. Good and great teachers and head teachers are driven by a sense of moral purpose, and that applies to the majority of teachers and head teachers, and they would no more drive students into the wrong course or deliberately drop a subject because it was no longer counted, then they would turn a blind eye to the emotional neglect of a child. And I think it's important that I take this opportunity, which you've very kindly given me, to underline the fact that I believe, like Tony Blair, in intervention in inverse proportion to success. Where schools and teachers are flourishing, as they are in the vast majority of areas, let's celebrate that. But where there are problems and children are losing out, let's tackle it.
Thank you, Secretary of State. I have to respond to say I think that is a little naive. If you create the framework, you create the incentives, don't blame the people within the system if they follow the incentives you created by some appeal to a higher... We had a head teacher when the English baccalaureate brought in who did half courses in history and geography. Tremendous success in his school with people going on to A-level and doing well. He came here, sat there and told us he was dismantling it because his parents were not going to put up with him having a 0% of children getting the English baccalaureate. People will follow the incentives you create, and you shouldn't be naive or try and suggest there's people's moral failings if they deliver what you say you want. If you say you want something and the system says it wants something, that's what you'll get. I'll move on.
I respectfully disagree, but you put your case with characteristic panache.
Tessa.
You've listed the various things you're going to do. I just wondered if you could spend a few moments explaining to the committee how you'll measure the progress of pupils throughout their school career as part of the floor standards.
Well, we're making sure that schools which are, as I was just discussing with the chairman, schools which are subject to floor standards at primary, not only have to ensure that a certain percentage of children get to level 4 at Key Stage 2, i.e. reach the expected level of literacy and numeracy, but also that they're making 2 levels of progress from Key Stage 1 to Key Stage, from Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 2. And then when it applies to secondary schools, we're also making sure that children make the expected level of progress there as well. And by subdividing students into those which have low, average or high prior attainment, then we're making sure that schools have to have a care towards those children who have not done well, either earlier in primary school or at primary school before they go to secondary school, and also that schools are incentivised to stretch the more able students in order to get the most out of them as well.
So what happens, I'm interested to know what happens where you find a particular school or maybe variances in performance. Where does that lead us?
Well, it depends to an extent on how variable the performance is. I think that if schools are doing brilliantly well and outstanding, one of the things that I want to do, and I know that the new Chief Inspector also wants to do, is to shine a light on their superb performance and to draw attention to it. The best Ofsted reports I've read have not been those on individual schools. They've been those which have highlighted those schools that have been successful. One under the last administration, which looked at 12 high-performing comprehensives in difficult circumstances. One when this government's been in power, which has looked at schools which are superb when it comes to teaching reading and English at primary level. And the data can lead us towards schools that are outperforming the average and achieving amazing things. When schools are performing less well, then there are a variety of interventions that we can put in place. And some of those interventions will be driven by the community or others, noticing that schools are underperforming. But if schools fall below the floor standard or are near to falling below the floor standard, then we can have conversations with the individual schools and with the local authorities about which of the tools at our collective disposal nationally are best to help them raise standards.
And how do you expect head teachers of individual schools to deal with underperforming or a lack of significant progression in particular classes? How quickly will that happen?
Well, again, with a good leader, using data wisely, then it can be addressed quickly. The most important thing to do is to ensure that if children are not meeting expected levels of progress, that you analyse what's happening in the classroom. So do you have the right teacher? Does that teacher have the right support? Is the material that they are using appropriate? And the best head teachers are being held increasingly accountable. In fact, all head teachers are being held increasingly accountable as a result of the range of tools that we use. And good head teachers will tackle underperformance on the part of any particular member of staff, and they can do everything from ensuring that that teacher's practice is observed, ensuring that teacher can observe other good practice, ensuring that teacher is supported, or work with other schools which have a track record in success and nipping problems in the bud in order to raise their own standards as well. So the 100 new teaching schools that we've established are explicitly designed to spread examples of outstanding teaching into schools where performance hasn't been as good as it should be.
Okay, fine. I want to go back to the business of performance measures like the EBAC, which might encourage schools to divert their resources away from the most disadvantaged. I just wondered whether you'd like to comment on that.
Again, I think that is that reflects an attitude in this country which we have got to tackle. The assumption that disadvantaged children won't do well in English or mathematics, or history or geography, or sciences, or foreign languages, is basically saying, you're poor, well, don't imagine that you can aspire to do well in these areas. Know your place. I think that attitude is wrong. It doesn't occur in other advanced nations. It shouldn't happen here. The assumption that the English baccalaureate is somehow a choice for posh kids is actually the sort of attitude that, for example, drove Tony Crosland wild in the 1960s. The assumption is that background will automatically dictate opportunity. Well, I've seen enough amazing schools educating children from really tough backgrounds, giving them stretching and satisfying subjects, to know that that's wrong. And to say that because a child comes from a particular background that your expectations should automatically be lowered is to my mind, to write children off before their lives have even properly begun, and that's wrong. And the purpose of education is the precise opposite. It's to say that every individual soul is precious, every child is capable of achieving excellence, and to make sure that that child is stretched and that no excuses are made.
But a lot of the problems, I mean, listening to the radio this morning talking about, Alison Wolfe was on the radio this morning talking about gaming and using the use of single measures being dominant and having particular focus on GCSEs this morning, of course, and the value of one subject or another. That actually calls into question if we're going to say that there is, academic prowess in a certain set of subjects at a particular standard. Others will naturally fall away, will they not? And yet, actually, people are matched to all sorts of different talents and skills. And those vocational, we're in danger, are we not, of dismantling the structure that has given some value to vocational subjects?
I know exactly the danger to which you allude. And if I thought that we were in danger of collectively undermining technical and vocational education, I would be worried. But as Alison pointed out, it will still be the case after the reforms announced today that English 16-year-olds will be the world leaders amongst 16-year-olds internationally in the number and scale of vocational qualifications which they take. All other countries, including countries which have much better records in vocational and technical education, like Germany, expect children to follow a general curriculum to the age of 16. And those countries which do superbly in vocational and technical education, like Singapore, expect children to have English, mathematics, sciences, and a foreign language at 16. Now, after that, the institutions to which children will go, or young people by that stage will go, vary. And it's important, I think, that children up to the age of 16 are introduced to a wide range of options which can help motivate and excite them. And that will include space in the curriculum for anything from the various different types of design and technology to other courses that can be developed in the future. However, it's important to make sure that we do not limit children's choices before the age of 16, that we give them the chance to fulfill their potential subsequently, and that means not arbitrarily saying that they should pursue courses which limit rather than enhance the capacity to progress afterwards.
Okay, I mean, I just recognise that certainly in my county there are young people who possibly need to change what they're doing before the age of 16. And that at 14 it might be appropriate for them to change their educational setting or whatever, but actually to change what it is that they're learning because they might be particularly interested in something that's less academic.
I think it's important to make sure that children who all children have, I'll start again because I was going to utter something that was even for a politician banal to the point of irrelevance, which is that all children have lots of different interests. There will be children who will be more effectively motivated by some subjects which are vocational and technical, absolutely. And it's important that schools take account of that, and the development of university technical colleges is part of that, and our changing of some of the rules about further education lecturers and their ability to teach in schools is intended to ensure that schools can provide that. But it is important that we don't fall into an either-or trap of assuming that because we want to motivate children and inspire them with vocational and technical education before 16, that we so limit the range of subjects that they study up to the age of 16 that they've made irreversible and possibly limiting decisions.
Okay, thank you.
Charlotte.
Thank you very much. I just want to go on from that, and in a simple answer, if you can. Do you think the government's response to Alison Wolfe's report in stripping the status of equivalence from so many vocational qualifications, do you think that's going to add value to the concept of vocational education overall, or do you think it's going to strip value from the concept of vocational education?
I think it will add value to vocational education and to education overall, because I think no one is served if you encourage students to pursue qualifications which don't allow them to make progress subsequently. And one of the problems was, as David Blunkett pointed out on the radio this morning, he wanted between 1997 and 2001 to stress the importance of vocational and technical education. Quite right too, one of many good things he did. However, there were changes made to performance tables subsequently in 2004, which led to a massive increase in the number of these subjects these qualifications, I should say, being pursued. And as David Blunkett himself said, that was wrong. It was a misalignment of resources. And it meant that there were students, as Alison's report pointed out, who were doing qualifications which they thought would lead to a job, and then they found that employers and further education colleges did not value them. And nothing is more likely to harm vocational education than people being tempted to follow a course and then discovering that that course doesn't provide them with the employment opportunities that they'd yearned for.
The argument often made for qualifications having equivalent status is that there's a balance between a child who finds more traditional academic qualifications harder to grasp and who needs some kind of confidence building and encouragement in order to feel that they're part of the educational establishment. And the argument of those who say that the equivalents shouldn't have had their status stripped was those equivalents provided those children who found the academic world slightly less accessible than others some kind of sense of status. Do you think that status was worth is worth the consequence of job finding afterwards?
I understand the argument, and it's motivated by good intentions. But ultimately, if you say to a student, we the state are going to value this qualification as an equivalent, but then the colleges to which they apply subsequently and the employers with whom they're seeking a job say no, then that child will understandably feel betrayed and let down. I think it is right to say that there are a range of activities beyond those which count in GCSE performance tables that can help motivate children to learn. And I also think it's right that there are a significant number of qualifications which should count in those tables. And it's still the case that there are 125 qualifications that will count in performance tables and around 50 odd qualifications that will count in the GCSE performance tables alongside GCSEs. And it's also the case that awarding bodies can develop new qualifications, and provided there's external testing, those qualifications allow a child to make progress thereafter, and they're graded. They're not simply pass-fail, but you can go from A to F or whatever it might be. Then they can count. So I think what we've done is that we've got rid of the tendency to game, which the committee is quite rightly worried about, but at the same time provided the opportunity for balance in the construction of a curriculum up to the age of 16 and in performance tables by which schools are judged.
And while all this is going on, while the EBAC's taking place, while many qualifications have their equivalency status stripped, there's also the rise of studio schools and university technical colleges. Do you think that is going to increase the status of vocational education, or do you think you're creating a two-tier system?
I don't think we're creating a two-tier system because, in a way, we already have, and we've inherited a multi-tier system. There are, in our education system at the moment, there are high-performing schools which people will spend money to move their families closer to, other schools which are viewed in some cases fairly, in some cases unfairly as underperforming, which people will shun. The point about university technical colleges is that you could argue they're in the first tier of schools. They are well-funded, elite establishments which are built around vocational and technical education. Now, I would stress that many of these university technical colleges will offer academic GCSEs in English, mathematics, sciences, modern foreign languages, and they will do well. Some of them, and this is, I think, is a striking thing, some of them will say, we're strong enough to say everything that we offer is brilliant, so we don't need to be judged by the English Baccalaureate. I think the English Baccalaureate is a very, very useful measure. It exposes a variety of things that have gone wrong in our education system, but schools that feel that it's not necessarily right for them, their ethos or their pupils, should feel strong enough to say, we're taking a different approach. They will have to justify, quite rightly, that decision to parents, but there is no penalty from the government in saying that you've got a 0% score in the EBAC if you are doing well in other measures.
Secretary, so you, in the white paper in 2010, you said you were going to bring in a destination measure.
Yes.
Which certainly, again, I would like to see developed as part of a balanced scorecard.
Yes. Where
children ultimately end up seems to me a pretty fundamental measure of whether it's successful or not. How are you getting on in developing that measure?
Well, I think I agree with you, and we hope to have one as part of performance tables before the end of this Parliament.
Thank you very much. Pat.
Thank you. Secretary of State, you said that you believe in floor targets and will intervene where schools do not reach those floor targets. Can I ask you about the infrastructure around school improvement? The committee have heard much evidence, and certainly my experience tells me that most local authorities are really good at school improvement where a school fails, that they're getting quickly and they're able to support schools where they fail. But the scaffolding around school improvement appears to be being dismantled at the moment. So we've got school improvement services which are losing very experienced staff through cuts in public expenditure, school improvement partners disappearing, national strategies have gone, the national and London challenges. And when I asked Michael Barber about this and said there is a gap in the system, yes, we've got increasing numbers of schools who are becoming academies, there's nothing between the academies and the Secretary of State, and he agreed that yes, this could possibly be a vacuum in the system, that, and I think his words were that, you know, this is where Mr. Gove's educational experiment may have problems. What's going to happen when schools start to fail? Are you personally going to intervene? Is there a system in place for intervention when schools fail?
Well, again, some of the assumptions contained within the question I agree with. Some I would contest. I think the quality of local authority intervention in underperforming schools has been variable. I think that there are some local authorities that have been strong and assertive, and there are other local authorities that have done a poor job in particular areas. We would not have so many schools below the floor if every local authority were doing its job as it should.
Yeah, there are very few schools below floor now.
Well, in primary, there are more than 1,000 schools below the floor. And we are increasing the floor because we expect, quite rightly, that schools should continue to do better and better and better. One of the reasons why there are fewer schools below the floor is because of the work that has been undertaken by academy chains and others to turn around the performance of those schools that have been underperforming. And this comes to the heart of the point.
Can I just bring you back to what we're going to do if schools fail?
That's what we're doing now. Because you make the point about school improvement services. In your own county in Durham, I think there are a staff of something around 50 working in school improvement.
There's a lot less than there were.
There are fewer than there were.
There are a lot less than there were.
But 50 people working in school improvement in a county the size of Durham is a formidable team when you think about it. Formidable in terms of numbers.
And we also have some incredibly high achieving schools.
And some very low achieving schools as well.
And very few below floor, Secretary of State.
There are some that are teetering just on the edge of it.
I think actually one below floor. But let's not fall out of that.
No, indeed.
What are we going to do about this vacuum in school improvement?
I don't believe there's a vacuum. I think what we've moved to is a different model, and that model builds on precisely what you drew attention to, which is the success of things like the London Challenge. Why was there a need for the London Challenge? Because not every local authority in London was doing its job. What did the London Challenge involve? Specifically teaming high-performing schools with low-performing schools.
But in the new world, where London Challenge will not be there, what will be there to support schools that fail?
We're doing what the London Challenge succeeded in doing nationwide. Our network of 100 teaching schools, due to be 500, we hope, by the end of this Parliament, will empower those schools that are already high-performing in terms of teaching and learning. And I think a critical problem with the old model of school improvement is that you often had people who were not, who were ex-teachers and ex-head teachers who were promoted up and out of the education front line and who became enmeshed in a bureaucracy. What we now have are people who are currently superb head teachers and teachers helping those at the front line because they're wrestling with the same problems. And I think that it's through school-to-school relationships that we can drive improvement. That can be done through academy chains. It can also be done through the superb work that national leaders of education are doing.
So can I ask you how many schools now are receiving funding under the Education Endowment Fund? If schools are going to support schools, just how many are there?
Well, the Education Endowment Fund is explicitly designed not to be responsible for that system-level school improvement. It's supposed to invest in specific programmes which will pioneer or pilot ways of raising attainment amongst poorer children. So it's the job of the National College, which is the organisation responsible for accrediting teaching schools, to drive the progress that you quite rightly want to see. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, 100 teaching schools that have been accredited and given resources. We also have a growing number of academy chains which are taking more and more sponsored academies, i.e. underperforming schools, under their wing.
So how many? How many, you said growing numbers of chains, of academies who will take this job on. How many? We've got 100 accredited schools.
Yes, going on to become 500 in due course. And we have had, I think, in terms of sponsored academies, we've had more than 200 new sponsored academies created since the last election, and there are many more coming. And we have academy chains which are growing at a faster rate.
Secretary of State,
Yes.
with respect, how many of these schools are supporting other failing schools?
Every school that becomes an academy, and these are the new academies which convert, has to be in a relationship with another school which it is committed to help. Now, some of those schools will be, how can I put this fairly, very poorly performing, and other schools will be schools which are on a route to improvement. And each individual teaching school will be helping a network of other schools as well. It's also the case if we look at the underperforming primaries.
So
Yes.
is that part of the funding agreement? That as soon as you become an academy, you get a named school that you are supporting? Because I've got academies in my constituency, outstanding schools, that are not supporting other failing schools.
Well, I'd be very interested in the details of the individual academies that are not living up to that. But it's done before the funding agreement stage.
Right, so you don't accept that the whole of the scaffolding around school improvement being dismantled, that we won't have a vacuum in the system?
I do believe that the whole scaffolding around school improvement is being dismantled. I think we're putting in place a new and improved school improvement approach. That's why we're fighting a battle in North London at the moment, because there's a local authority that has not been capable of generating improvement in its schools. It's why we're having a struggle with your own local authority at the moment,
Right.
because Durham refuses to acknowledge the level of underperformance it has in many parts of its county. I'm very happy to go to Durham and explain to them precisely why their schools should be doing better and why it's wrong for them to employ 50 people who have not done a good enough job in the past.
Can I move on, as you've mentioned a school in North London? You said in the white paper that we want to make it clear that schools, governors, head teachers and teachers have responsibility for schools and school improvement. So do you think that your intervention in Downhill Primary epitomises that?
I believe it epitomises what I said earlier, which is the Blairite approach, which is intervention in inverse proportion to success.
But this is the school that's doing well. This is the school that's
No, it's
got
not.
a new head teacher. It may not be doing well enough, but it is doing well and it is improving. And do you really think that your intervention epitomises, we make clear that schools, governors, head teachers run schools?
In the best circumstances, that's what should happen. But sometimes there is a need to intervene. My job is to make sure that standards rise in the education system. Standards are not good enough in that school. And they haven't been good enough for years. There are children leaving that school who are not reaching accepted levels in literacy and in numeracy. Their life chances are blighted. We are taking action. There are other primaries in Haringey where the head and the governors acknowledge that performance has been poor. They're grateful for the offer of help from the Department for Education. They're exploring relationships with other academy sponsors, and I think that is the right approach to take. What we've seen in Haringey around this particular school is a campaign led by the Anti-Academies Alliance, which is a Socialist Workers' Party-backed campaign. We've had an NUT official who operates at taxpayers' expense leading that campaign. And we've had a reprise of all the enemies of promise who fought against what Andrew Adonis and Tony Blair were trying to do, reconstituting themselves. And I think it's a great pity
Secretary of State,
that the Labour Party hasn't spoken out against this trot campaign.
What we see is... You're nothing if not controversial, you really are. What we see is a school that we accept has not done well enough, but it has a new head teacher, it has a new governing body, it is making improvements. Do you really think that your interference in the way that you have sits well with a government that says, we believe that head teachers should lead?
Yes, because it will be a head teacher that will turn that school round. But it goes back to one of the points that I made earlier to the chairman. On the one hand, there is a criticism that is made of us, that we are a laissez-faire, couldn't care less. It only matters to us what happens in grammar schools in rich areas. And then on the other hand, we're accused of being heavy-handed ogres and intervening in these areas. Well, we can't simultaneously be couldn't care less figures and wild interventionists. The truth is that our policy reflects what happens in all high-performing organisations. If people are doing a brilliant job, applaud them. Get out of their way. Occasionally ask them why they do so well and see if you can apply those lessons more broadly. If things aren't working, then get stuck in. And indeed, in those local authorities that were and are performing well, the same thing applies. So in a good local authority, they'll applaud the great schools and
intervene. So a selective approach.
Yes.
Right, can I move on to curriculum? Secretary of State, I've worked over many years with young people who even getting to school on a morning is a major achievement for them. Their lives are incredibly difficult and chaotic. So actually getting to school is a big issue. For many years, people like me have had a real push on attendance and on creating a curriculum that will keep those young people interested and in school. Don't you feel that some of the way in which equivalents have been rubbished recently in the press and some of the announcements today, that for some of these young people, and the announcements about things like EBAC, pushing those young people down a sausage factory of curriculum that has things like classical Judaism and Latin, they are simply going to vote with their feet?
Secretary of State.
No, because I think the most important thing about... I agree with you about attendance. I think it's too low. And I think we need to change the culture. We've got a fantastic head teacher, Charlie Taylor, who's joined the department. He'll be publishing a report shortly on some of the things that we can do to improve attendance. And I think you're right that we should shift. It's implicit in your question, and I think it's absolutely right. Shift from truancy to attendance. And there are a number of things that parents and schools can do. But I don't agree with you that we shouldn't be more demanding of young people. The whole point is that school isn't like the movies or a club. Please come along and we hope that you'll find it exciting, and if you don't, then that's fine, that's okay with you. It is the responsibility of parents to ensure that children attend school. It's the responsibility of schools to ensure that children are ready to progress afterwards. I don't think in most cases that classical Hebrew or Latin will be the courses that most schools will choose to motivate and prepare their students for the future. But I think it's unacceptable that people are bristling at the requirement that we have children who are doing English, mathematics and science to an acceptable level. And if we say that we will, tolerate or accept non-attendance on the basis that school is too hard, then I think that we're condemning children to a future where at every stage when they face a challenge, we will make excuses rather than encourage them to do better, and that way lies perdition.
Thank you. Pat, I'm afraid I'm going to have to move on, I'm afraid, Pat. Neil.
Thank you very much. There's a general trend here developing. And Michael, you've said that local authorities have an indispensable role to play as champions of children and parents, and that is certainly welcome. But if we have a lot more academies, what kind of role is that going to be? What sort of tools are those local authorities going to have?
Well, this is precisely, and I think Pat alluded to it as well, precisely the debate that people like Michael Barber and Michael Wilshaw have raised. And I ask myself the question, not what is the right role for local authorities, but what do we need to do in order to ensure that our education system is performing to the best of all our collective abilities, and within that there will be certain roles that will naturally settle on local authorities. I think local authorities, this is my attempt to answer a question which I think should not be taken as a final answer, as by definition it needs to be a broader conversation involving local authorities, teachers, elected politicians at every level, everyone. But my first attempt to answer it is to say local authorities have a role in making sure that admissions are fair, coordinating them, and making sure that you don't have any gaming of the admission system.
Short answer, please.
Okay.
It's a complicated question.
No, but I'll try and answer. Okay, admissions, support for high-need pupils, particularly in terms of SEN, issues like transport, and I think that they also can have a critical role if you move to a local authority area where the majority of schools, or indeed all schools, have become academies, then I think they can take on a different role as commissioner of services, and that's something which we need to explore.
In terms of admissions, one of the issues about academies is, of course, that they might want to grow and expand, and you're going to, by definition, get some form of competition between certain schools. How will the local authorities manage that, and what kind of policy drivers do you think should be applied by local authorities to make sure that parents, at the end of the day, can exercise choice?
I think it's a good thing if schools feel a sense of friendly rivalry towards one another. And I've noticed that in areas like Hackney, where you have had academies seeking to compete against one another in order to perform well, then that has driven standards up and meant that you've had schools that were previously underperforming and losing pupils become high-performing and oversubscribed. I think the local authority's role is explicitly to ensure that when you come to coordinated admissions that you don't have any attempt to use some of the dodges that may have existed in the past. But I do believe that the changes that we've made to the admissions code help empower anyone who's concerned about problems that exist.
Okay, thanks. If we continue having more and more schools turning into academies, then of course at the end of the day the local authority will be effectively further diminished by its capacity to intervene. So what kind of solution would you have for the remaining schools which perhaps might need intervention or assistance from local authorities?
Well, I don't think that the local authority need necessarily be diminished. I think that the prospect of a school becoming an academy can often raise the performance of the local authority, because previously, when it came to everything from school improvement to the provision of SEN services, it was take it or leave it. You know, you've got to rely on us. Now you move to a situation where a school can become an academy and decide to buy into the services from its own council or from another local authority, or from others, and it's striking that local authorities, which I think are doing a good job, like Manchester, are moving towards a traded approach towards school improvement services. I think that we're moving to a situation where local authorities, if they're enterprising and imaginative, have new opportunities. Local authorities say that they can provide services more effectively because of economies of scale and inbuilt expertise. Well, now there's an opportunity for the best local authorities to paint on a broader canvas.
Do you imagine a world where all schools are actually academies?
I think more and more schools are going to be autonomous, yes, and I anticipate that before the end of this Parliament, more than half of secondary schools will become academies. But there will be some schools that will say, not for us.
And you're happy for that to be the case in sort of the long term?
Yes, I think it's important that head teachers should make a decision that's right for them, and there are some who will say that despite the attractions, it's not going to be right for us. But at the moment, the evidence suggests to me that there's been significant enthusiasm on the part of head teachers for it.
What do you think of Sir Michael Wilshaw's plans, or ideas at least, for a sort of an intervening person or structure, commission and so forth, between the school and you as at the Department of Education?
I think it goes back to the point that Pat raised earlier, which is that there is a debate about what should exist between the department and individual schools. Now, in some ways, many of the functions that Sir Michael identified were provided by his old employer, ARC. So ARC had ways of ensuring that you teamed high-performing heads with those who were doing less well. You had very, very rigorous monitoring of how every school was doing. You had shared services, and indeed they're even moving towards, having their own pupil referral units and having their own approach towards children who are at risk of exclusion. So ARC, in that respect, provides, as far as I can see, as effectively as any local authority, many of the services that local authorities used to provide in a geographically dispersed network of schools. And I think that Sir Michael is asking, who is going to provide that in the future? Academy chains may provide it in certain circumstances. Local authorities might provide it in certain circumstances. But his argument is that we may well need school commissioners, perhaps working out of the Office of the School Commissioner in the department, operating on a regional level. I think it's important that, having stripped back bureaucracy at the centre and locally, that we don't reimpose it. But I think he's right, and Pat is right, to say that we need to think hard as structures evolve about what the best way is of supporting the beneficial changes that have occurred.
Moving on to the question of school governance, because I think that's quite a key thing with autonomous schools.
Yes.
And I believe that it's important that we think in terms of the skills that governors have, the responsibilities that they have, the question of whether or not they are stakeholder representatives and so forth. How far is the department going to move in a way which might actually free up schools to actually think more about the kind of governing body that they might want?
I think it's a very good point. I mean, I think that, again, sometimes cliches embody truths, and one cliche that embodies a big truth is that governors are the unsung heroes and heroines of the school education system. And indeed they embody what Conservatives and Liberal Democrats mean by the big society. We believe that we should provide more support for chairs of governing bodies and the national colleges there to help provide them with the support and training that they may need to do their job even better. I think that some schools have too many governors and some governing body meetings are too long and obsessed with, not obsessed, that's the wrong word, spend too much time dealing with marginal issues rather than core issues. I think that we should encourage schools towards having a tighter group of governing bodies. Governors should be chosen on the basis of their skills rather than the organisation or interest that they represent. And we can learn a lot from shining a light on the practice of the best schools. I've been really encouraged by the response of the business community, who are trying to encourage more and more people with a background in business to use some of their skills to enhance what governing bodies provide. But as ever, I'm interested in those schools that feel that they've cracked this, have got it right, and would like to use the Department for Education as a platform for explaining to other schools how they can benefit from the progress they've made.
In terms of accountability of governors, who do you think they should be accountable to, and how would that work in an autonomous school?
Well, ultimately, I think everyone within the school, head and governing body, are accountable to the broader community of parents that they serve, and they can be held accountable both through published data and through Ofsted inspections, and through the contribution that school makes to children's opportunities and the health of the community overall. But again, it goes back to the sort of the debate that we've been wrestling with this morning, which is that there are some accountability levers which can bear more weight than others. But there is no single, and there should be no single measure by which you judge the performance of a school. There are some that are significantly more important than others, but you have to make a judgment in the round.
Lisa.
Thank you.
Do you accept that communities have a right to know where resources for education are being allocated?
Broadly, yes.
In November, I asked the schools minister when he would publish the funding agreements for the first round of free schools, and I was told in due course. This month I asked him again when they would be published, and I was told in due course. Given that the first free schools are now up and running, can you explain to the committee what the delay is in publishing those agreements?
I think we've published the funding agreements for the first 24 free schools. I think they're available on the DFE website, aren't they? Correct. Yes.
Can you could you point us to those funding agreements, because the schools minister is still telling me that they'll be published in due course.
I'm sorry, I'll have a word with the schools minister, but I think we published them, I think it was a fortnight ago, or thereabouts, between
conferring, I think.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure.
That's the way this challenge works. Lisa.
I wanted to make sure that I didn't mislead the committee, and if Lisa was affirming something so strongly, then I doubted my own recollection.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Alex.
First of all, retweets from the public. What evidence do you have that the pupil premium is working?
Well, I don't have all the evidence yet. Point one, we've put in a significant sum of public money. Point two, it's been welcomed by the majority of head teachers. Point three, there are new accountability measures that will let us know how those students who are in receipt of it perform in every school. Point four, we want to have Ofsted.
Sorry to interrupt you, the linguistics around this have a great history in this committee. Are they a performance measure rather than an accountability measure?
Oh, which?
You just said that there are accountability measures around the people bringing them. I don't believe under the definitions used by your department that there are. I think they're performance measures, not accountability measures.
I wish.
And the Minister of Schools thinks that's very important. We thought the distinction's amusing, but we want you to stick with your Minister of Schools.
Well, I love my Minister of Schools, and I will stick with him to the last. As I said earlier.
Let me save you.
Okay.
Clearly, you don't know yet, so we need to
don't
look
know
into
what?
the future. You don't know how if the premium is actually working currently, because there hasn't been sufficient time. But let me tell you, it's mentioned.
Well, what would you consider to be sufficient time?
Some schools with relatively high numbers of children on free school meals have had little or no extra cash. They say that you've given with one hand and taken away with the other. What evidence do you actually have that such schools have had real budget increases which reflect the full pupil premium? So they've actually got real cash to do real things with these children.
Well, to go back to the first question, which you chose to answer yourself, we haven't had enough time yet because the pupil premium has only just started arriving in schools.
But what about the cash? I mean, what
Yes.
about real cash in schools?
Yes, well, what we've done is that we've maintained spending at flat cash across the education system. We've removed ring fencing.
So you've taken it with one hand, you're giving one hand and taking it back with the other in some cases?
No, we haven't.
Yes, you have.
Well, that is your view, Alex, and one to which you are well entitled. But
with respect, it's the view of many head teachers. But
there are many things that head teachers quite rightly draw to my attention and complain about. But let's, you ask a question about funding. I don't think it's possible to have a debate about funding of any public service without taking account of the devastating economic inheritance that this government
let's assume that the schools have got the cash. You've referred
no,
to
Alex, no. Let me make this point. Let me make this point. You are saying that overall, you argue at the very least, in the worst cases, that schools have just as much money as they ever had before. What does it say about this government and its commitment to progressive values that at a time when we inherited a huge level of debt left by the government, of which you were not part, but for which you voted, that we're still able to prioritise education?
Questions. You're here to give the answers. You've referred to...
Yes, and I am giving the answer, and the answer is that relative to the blight...
It's wonderful that the Tory government have maintained spending on education.
Yes,
no
increased it.
About it. I've yet to be convinced of that. But you've referred
Facts
to the
are shields that win a day.
You've referred to the monitoring the success of children who attract the pupil premium. Can you tell us how will that work, and how do you ensure that that cash is targeted at the individuals and not just swallowed up in the overall budget? I recollect seeing times when the kids who were looked after, additional money was going in, and nobody could actually tell me what was happening to that money. So how do we make sure that the individuals who attract the pupil premium are targeted with that cash?
It's a fair point, and the system is often... the problem has often arisen with children who have special educational needs and who've attracted specific funding as well. You can choose from the centre or from anywhere to micromanage how every penny is spent in the school, or you can trust professionals, give them autonomy, and then hold them accountable. And that's what I believe is right. So we give significant sums, and they will rise, and they will become even more significant sums, because we've only given schools a quarter, or we've only seen a quarter of what will eventually be the entire pupil premium going to schools. And as more money goes in, I expect that we will see in the measures of the performance of children who receive the pupil premium real gains.
Right, but we've seen the the additional support grant from LAs has been cut in order to support the pupil premium. Do you still hold with the additional funding thing? If the local authorities aren't putting the money in and you're putting it in instead, is that just an even Steven thing that we're not actually seeing extra cash?
I had a look at some of the statistics on local authority spending. In 2010, they were published last week, between 2010 and 11. And I saw that in many areas, local authority spending in a variety of things like child protection and other areas had increased. There's a view, a widespread one, sedulously promoted by critics of this government, that spending in many of these areas has been crudely slashed. Not at all. Spending in a variety of areas for children at local authority level in 2010 and 11 increased.
Can I ask you about how we make sure that the schools get the money that they need? There's lots of people choose, whether it's for stigma reasons or whatever, or they don't claim, nor do the children take the free school meals.
Yes.
So they don't actually attract the pupil premium. What are you actually going to do about that to make sure that where we have the neediest kids, whether they accept free school meals or not, they're still getting the pupil premium?
We're doing everything possible to encourage schools to persuade parents that it's in their interests to register their children.
We've done that for generations, trying to encourage, even if it was just for the case of the person having a good school meal once a day.
Yes.
But what else can we do? I mean, we haven't managed over the years to attract the people who are probably most in need, who need to attract that extra cash.
Well, you're absolutely right that there are some parents whose children would benefit from free school meals who won't have registered. But one of the things that many schools are doing is making it easier when children themselves get their dinners for any of the stigma that might have attached to a child being in receipt no longer to exist, so that you will have a swipe card system where it's not clear who's paying and who's not paying. And schools are becoming more and more sophisticated, and we're doing everything we can. My colleague Sarah Tether, who's the Minister who leads on the Pupil Premium in my department, has, through all the skills that a superb Lib Dem campaigner has at her disposal, brought to the attention of schools everywhere what they should do. And I was going to say, if you're going to have one politician in the House of Commons draw to people's attention the importance of a new government initiative, then there are a few people better than Sarah with her campaigning skills.
So you're not going to have a more sophisticated matrix for determining which schools should get the pupil premium?
Other than eligibility for free school meals. Yeah. I think it's the best, but no method is ever going to be perfect when it comes to identifying deprivation. Free school meals was used by the last government, is used by this government as a proxy for it. And by definition, if we're thinking about a school overall...
So how can we extend it to get more of the pupil premiums into the schools where the kids
Well, we are extending it so that it no longer applies only to children who are eligible for the free school meals in that year, but to children who may have been eligible for free school meals in previous years. So we're getting over one of the problems, which was quite rightly identified, I think, by this committee amongst others, which is that if you have a family that moves from being eligible to free school meals out of it, as quite rightly they get jobs and do better, then the school may lose out. Not anymore. If you've been eligible for free school meals previously, your school's eligible for the pupil premium now and in the future.
Well, finally, do you think the premium is a sufficient incentive for schools to prioritise children from poorer backgrounds when it comes to admissions?
It's an incentive, but I'd like there to be even more incentives for schools to prioritise children from poorer backgrounds. So it helps.
Do you accept it's possible that a school that is struggling to get to the floor might, when it doesn't, there's no ring fencing of the pupil premium, may dedicate its best resources, human and otherwise, to the borderline, and that will predominantly mean that they aren't focusing their attention and their best people on the poorest? Is that possible? And if that turns out, in your view, proves to be the case, would you consider having an accountability rather than a performance measure so that it would trigger intervention if schools failed to deliver on an improvement for the poorest children in our schools?
Anything is possible. You can never devise any system of performance or accountability which won't mean that someone somewhere, if they were determined to game it, will find a way of doing so. All you can do is try to minimise the chance of that happening. That's what we've sought to do. As for the distinction between performance and accountability, obviously, in a way, we should have, rather than no conferring, I should have Bertrand Russell with me here in order to attempt to analyse what these two different approaches towards language truth, or maybe Freddie Eyre, language truth and logic.
Or perhaps, Secretary of State, we should have people with more experience of running organisations and business to understand the power of incentives to drive behaviour. Because if you don't understand the power of incentives, you won't understand the behaviour in the system which you're responsible for.
Well, I'm...
and you don't need a philosopher to tell you that. You need someone who's run organisations to tell you that.
Well, you've run many organisations, not least in the world of printing, very successfully. But one thing that I would say is that...
I wasn't bidding for your job, I must just
I know that you would do many, many jobs which are available to parliamentarians supremely well, and no doubt better than many, many other competitors. But, of course, we're aware that there are a variety of factors that drive behaviour. But I've been struck by the fact that this government, and in particular this department, has sought to use many of them. We know that, for example, when it comes to attracting teachers, that raising the bar on entry has changed the profile of people who've applied to become teachers. We know that placing an emphasis through the English baccalaureate on a wider range of subjects has had an influence as well. And the point that you make about drivers of behaviour is correct. And the analysis, I think, that we've made of what some of those drivers of behaviour are has seen beneficial results happening in the school system. Now, Alex said, can we know if the pupil premium is having an effect? There are some areas where we can see an effect in what we've done. We can see more students doing rigorous subjects. We can see more highly qualified people becoming teachers. We can see more schools choosing to become academies and using academy freedoms. So are things that we want to happen and that are good happening? Yes. Are there other things where it will take longer for the benefits of our policies to be seen occurring? Absolutely. But I would say that if you, rather than looking into the crystal ball, or indeed scrutinising the CVs of individuals who may or may not hold posts in the Department for Education, merely look at the record so far. And what in the record of the Department for Education so far strikes you that we're moving, or indeed anyone in the committee, that we're moving in the wrong direction?
Yes, well, it's important, Secretary, to say that you're still listening to improve the drivers within the system in order better to align them with the goals, which I think there's cross-party consensus on the goals. The question is whether we have the right mechanics in the system to drive those goals.
Well, we'll see, and if they're not, then we'll change them.
Thank you. Lisa.
The President of the ADCS paints a compelling picture of rising demand for children's services and a very distressing decrease in resources. I've since discovered that there are 3 times as many staff working on academy conversions and free schools in your department as there are in the safeguarding division. Given your aim of closing the gap between the most disadvantaged and the better off, how do you justify those priorities?
Because academy converters and free schools are helping to drive up standards for all children, particularly the most disadvantaged. And I don't think anyone can accuse us of neglecting safeguarding as an issue. We commissioned a report from Professor Eileen Munro, which was, I think, very well received, both amongst professional social workers and amongst directors of children's services, and which is a framework for reform. We have taken a whole new approach towards the publication of serious case reviews. We've provided a number of additional mechanisms of support for looked after children, and I think most critically, the role that Martin Neri has played as a ministerial advisor on adoption has helped focus attention not just on the importance of increasing the number of children who are adopted, but making sure that children who are at risk are taken into care and then found a secure placement, whether it's with foster carers or adoptive parents. So I think that naturally, you have high-quality staff from the Department for Education who are concentrating on a new programme which is achieving results, but you also have some superb staff who, including Dr. Jeanette Pugh, who's the official who deals with safeguarding, who've been doing a fantastic job in presiding over a reform programme there.
At the same time, Secretary of State, referrals to children's services jumped by 40,000 in 1 year. Action for Children say there are 5,000 vulnerable children who are without services. In the autumn statement, your Chancellor allocated £100 million for the Free Schools Initiative, and you recently made a statement that you know that the money that is available through the Early Intervention Grant is not as generous as any of us would like to see. If you don't put in those resources at crisis point to deal with rising demand in children's services when children are at crisis point, how do you expect them to achieve at schools?
Well, firstly, I don't think that goes back to Alex's point. I don't think any of us would say that we have all the money that we'd like to have, whether it's for free schools, academies, the early intervention grant that we give to local authorities, or in many other areas. The second thing that I would say is that actually the figures which were published last week showed that in 2010-11, while there were 1 or 2 areas of local government spending there where there was retrenchment, I think in particular when it came to child protection, there was an increase in the amount that was being made available, and entirely understandably so. With the vulnerable children that you refer to, I think that it's important we also acknowledge some of the other changes that are happening across government. I think the work that Louise Casey is leading in order to deal with the 120,000 most troubled families, I think is critical to helping to deal with that issue. I think the expansion of the number of health visitors and the support that we're giving, and I think the particular incentives that we hope to be able to better develop to ensure that Sure Start Children's Centres target the families most in need who perhaps haven't had a chance to benefit from those services. I think all of these are helping to move things in the right direction.
So do I understand you correctly that you think that the resources that are available for children's services at the current time are sufficient?
I think that the government does everything that it can within a very, very tight envelope to make sure that the vulnerable are protected. But I think all of us in the Department for Education would love to be able to devote more resources to a set of priorities, but for the reasons that I rehearsed with Alex, and I won't bore the committee by mentioning again, we don't quite have all the money at our disposal that we would like.
What about the £100 million in the autumn statement for free schools? Could that not be better spent on ensuring that children are helped at crisis point before it's too late?
Well, I think there is nothing more important than making sure that all children benefit from an improved education system. And of course, different governments might have different priorities about spending within different areas, but I think that when you've had an increase in spending on child protection at local authority level, and when you've had an emphasis overall on our part in making sure that money that's spent on the front line is more efficient, then I think that's an indication that professionals, whether directors of children's services or head teachers, are using the resources we give them to best effect.
Thank you. Damien.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary of State, one of the most refreshing things about the coalition government's approach in education is that every policy discussion starts with the question, where does this work best in the world? And when you look at those international comparisons, one of the recurring standout themes is that the number one driver of educational excellence is the quality of teachers.
Yes.
Trumping, for example, class size and other measures, apparently every time. And that's reflected in the title of the white paper, The Importance of Teaching. And it seems to be that actually it hits both of your goals. It's the most important thing in terms of raising overall attainment, but also apparently also in terms of narrowing the gap. And there's a lot of things the government is doing. There's very encouraging numbers coming through Teach First. Now the minimum entry standards, as you were mentioning a moment ago, raise the status of the profession, and also you're supporting teachers in matters of discipline and so on. But do you feel these things are enough to get us to something like a top third plus strategy, as happens in the leading countries in the world?
I'm always asking myself, what more can or should we do? And I think that no one could say that the Department for Education has been, and its officials have been, torpid or inactive over the last 20 months. But I demand of myself, of the department, and of the entire school system a better and better performance with every year that passes. And I'm looking constantly at the fact that other jurisdictions are innovating as well. So it's not enough to say, this is currently what they do in Finland, Singapore, South Korea, Massachusetts, or wherever. Let's get to there. What we want to do is to create a system where improvement is driven by what happens on the ground in our country, and we learn from the best there as well as learning from the best abroad, and constantly adapt. And I think this is a particular point that bears on one of the things that Pat said as well, and it also refers to Lisa's interest in free schools. We want to have innovation in this country which becomes an object of admiration elsewhere, and we want to do that by making sure that schools can continue to attract high quality teachers and then provide them with an environment in which they can do amazing things.
I mean, of course, people coming into the profession is only one part of the equation. There's an awful lot of people already in the profession. And in our current inquiry on attracting, developing and retaining the best teachers, we've focused a great deal also on continuing professional development and performance management. There's a constant complaint that you can go into teaching and effectively be there for decades without any effective personal development. And there also seems to be something of a lack of a culture of performance management, and that people who ultimately, after all the development they can have, ultimately aren't perhaps suited to teaching, leave. What more can be done in terms of development and performance management?
A huge amount. I think I've said before, and I'm happy to underline, that I think we've got the best generation of young people coming into teaching ever, and that's driving the standard overall up. But I think there are some people who entered teaching with high ideals who may have become stuck or demotivated. That's partly due to poor leadership from their senior leadership team, partly due to other factors. And one of the things that we need to think hard about is how we improve performance management. Some of the changes that were made are by Sally Coates in her review of teaching standards, and some of the things that we talked about when we were reviewing performance management and the capability procedures a couple of weeks ago, I think are helping to drive a culture change. But I also referred earlier to the work of high-performing schools, teaching schools and others, and I think part of the change is making sure that the classroom becomes a more open environment. You referred to other nations earlier. One of the striking things I found when I visited the Far East is that the classroom is an open environment in which teachers learn from the leaders of their profession who welcome observation, and then those who are either starting out or who feel that their practice has become becalmed also benefit from having other high-performing colleagues come in, observe, and then offer advice. And it's through that process of collaboration that we can drive improvement. But one thing I should say is that there are a number of partners with whom we should work in helping to improve professional development. I think the unions have a very strong role to play here. I'm very grateful, for example, for the leadership shown by the ATL's General Secretary Mary Bastard, who has been a champion of improved professional development. And there are also organisations like the Prince's Teaching Institute, which have done a great deal in particular to help deepen teachers' engagement with their subject. And I think there's more that can be done, including thinking about how we can offer sabbaticals and offer opportunities for teachers to refresh their subject knowledge, so that, as Michael Wilshaw has pointed out, we don't get burnout, but we get increased passion and re-engagement.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Ian.
Why did you decide to allow only academies to prioritise children eligible for pupil premium in their admissions policies? Why not all maintained schools? Could this not limit improvements in social mobility?
Yes, is the short answer. I think it was a case of saying we'll see if the benefits that free schools and academies, or the benefits that can be brought by having free schools and academies do this, work before going further. But my own personal preference is that one area where the admission system could change is making it easier and more attractive for all schools to prioritise them. But we were encouraged to car canny to begin with, so that's what we'll do. But I share, I think, the view behind your question. Yes, it might be worth extending.
Okay. Allowing schools to prioritise for admissions the children of staff will largely only impact on oversubscribed schools and will probably mean that some local children will miss out. How can you justify that?
Because we want to make sure that you keep good staff in schools where they can make a difference. And it seemed to us that if you've got someone who's a great teacher or a critical member of staff and they can't have their own child in that school, that may lead them to leave or to move, and it would be a tragedy if you had an integral member of the staff team going. Every child benefits if you've got someone who is critical to the success of a school there, whether it's a member of the support staff or a teacher. So again, it goes back to one of the chairman's points. Can you ever devise a perfect system in which everyone is happy? Well, apart from the way in which he allocates questions around the select committee, no. There will always be conflict and tough choices. But here we think that if you err on the side of making sure that top quality staff can stay there, then overall more people benefit.
Well, overall more people benefit, but it sounds like, you know, we're all in this together, but some of us are more in it than others, to me, from that perspective. I mean, it really does, and you know, some of the poorest kids with parents with less sharp elbows might be exactly the ones that would miss out in that context.
I hope that poorer children wouldn't, and I think that behind the question is there are 2 points. Firstly, is it the case that parents of poorer children are less anxious to get their children into good schools? I don't believe that. Is it the case that wealthier parents may have access to informal networks that enable them to know quite how to play the system? I think that was the case in the past. I think we're changing that now. I think you're right that we need to be vigilant that the admissions system is fair, but I think that the change for staff is a small beneficial change that won't adversely affect poorer children.
I mean, I think with respect to the Secretary of State, I mean, I've got parents of poorer children who, you're exactly right, you know, they will fight and scrap and you know, do the best for their kids. But I've got other parents in my constituency who frankly don't know what day it is. And therefore, from that perspective, there's a real danger that those youngsters could miss out in that context. Some grammar schools are seeking to expand, and there is talk of opening satellite schools. Would you welcome this? And what would the impact be on the children in those localities who don't gain admission to those satellites?
Okay. We have allowed all schools that wish to, which are successful, to expand. The particular case that I think has come to people's attention is in West Kent. In Kent, you're having a significant increase in population overall. And I think it was accepted both by the last government as it has been by this, that if you have population growth in an area where there is selective provision, then you should allow schools in that area to expand to take account of it. The number of children who were educated in grammar schools rose under the Labour government because of population growth. And because of population growth, the number of children overall who are going to be educated in every sort of school will rise in a selective area. If provision needs to grow in order to take account of that, that's absolutely fine. But it's not our intention to extend selection beyond those areas where it currently exists.
Thank you. Secretary of State, we're moving to a novel new section, quick-fire question and answers, if I can ask you for, inspired by the Twitter feed, hashtag #AskGove, 5,000 plus wanting to interact with you. So we're going to go around each of us and fairly strict time, and if you could give us quick answers, that would be great. So one is, if good requires pupil performance to exceed the national average, and if all schools must be good, how is this mathematically possible?
It's average for... by getting better all the time.
Thank you. So it is possible, is it?
It is possible to get better all the time.
Were you better at literacy than numeracy, Secretary of State?
I can't remember.
Can you please set out the chain of accountability for academies when things go wrong?
It depends who the sponsor is.
What evidence have you to indicate that the pupil premium is working?
We're gathering evidence on the ground now, and as Alex pointed out, given that the pupil premium is a relatively new addition, we'll come back to the committee and present all the evidence that we have in due course.
Why is there not the flexibility in the school admission code to allow summer-born preterm children to delay their entry to school by a year?
That requires a long answer.
You can have a little bit longer.
We want children to be in school learning as quickly as possible.
And therefore you rule that out, do you?
I'm more than happy to look at the arguments, but we spent quite a lot of time looking at them and decided that the most appropriate thing to do was to have as many children as possible benefiting from being in school as early as possible.
Well, you're very keen on international evidence. Another tweet is, why do we start schooling by 4 to 5 when evidence from Europe suggests that 7 is a more appropriate age and the end result is better?
Evidence from some countries suggests that it might be appropriate, evidence from other countries not. So you can have a situation in many Scandinavian nations where they do not have compulsory school attendance, but what they do have is a kindergarten system which is, to all intents and purposes, near universal. So engagement with education at the earliest possible stage, whether it's in a preschool setting, a kindergarten setting, or whatever, drives improvement later on. And my own view is that one of the good things the coalition government has done is extend the entitlement to preschool education to more children.
For Ofsted to give accurate judgments, should inspectors have had recent regular classroom experience as an outstanding teacher?
It helps. And one of the things that the Chief Inspector I know is anxious to do is to ensure that more outstanding heads qualify and serve as inspectors. Good thing too.
What's being done to ensure that schools and colleges are providing positive advice about apprenticeship routes?
All schools are under an obligation to provide high quality and impartial careers advice, and the destination data which you have championed and which we hope to implement will, I think, show those schools which are doing well in getting their students into apprenticeships and those schools which perhaps could do better.
Is it your, it's not a tweet, following up on that, are you happy with the way that careers advice is developing in schools? Do you see a danger in schools serving the institutional interest rather than the interest of the child by, for instance, trying to get them to stay on to sixth form, even if some alternative provision might be better for them?
I keep a watching brief on careers advice, and there's always a danger, as you yourself have pointed out, that in any system there may be different incentives. But I think one of the most important things about advice and guidance is that it is impossible for any individual or any single institution to have at their fingertips the range of information required in order to offer students access to what they need to know about the opportunities available to them. And that's why I think that technology in this area, as in teaching, has an enormous amount to offer in enhancing student choice.
What will you be doing to ensure local authorities stick to the law when producing policies regarding home education?
Everything I possibly can.
And another one on home education is, when is the government going to realise that home education is a viable option that produces good results and is not a welfare issue?
I've always maintained that home education can be a viable option, and in fact I've often praised those who do educate their children at home for making a sacrifice in their children's interests, which is admirable. Manifestly not for everyone, But I think you're absolutely right that you shouldn't conflate the two, and I think this was a mistake that some, not all, in the last government made.
Thank you very much. Damien.
Thank you, Chair. The gap between rich and poor that we talked about earlier is apparent before age 3. Now, as Frank Field says, what your parents do is more important than who they are. But it just so happens that there is a relationship between socio-economic group and, on average, things like reading daily to children, having set bedtimes and so on, all of which go on to impact school readiness. Given that the gaps don't seem to close later in life, that suggests that the most important place for public policy might be the very hardest place for public policy to affect, which is in the home. What can government, society do to improve the life chances of the poorest from those very early stages?
Firstly, make it clear that there's an uncompromising expectation that children from every background can succeed. And I think a lot of what we've done in challenging, for example, institutions, whether universities or whatever, and schools that aren't doing enough to encourage children to do well is part of an overall cultural drive to make our society more open and more socially mobile. I think there are specific things that we can do in terms of encouraging better parenting. There are 3 pilots in Camden and in 2 other local authority areas, I think Liverpool and Middlesbrough, but I'll get back to the committee, where we are piloting universal access to parenting classes. And I think it's also the case that schools themselves can help inculcate the right attitudes in parents, and the very best schools take that very seriously.
For decades, education economists have said the smart thing to do is take money out of tertiary education and put it into early years, because that's where you get the best return, and so on. And that's exactly what's happened over the last 15 years. But the millennium cohort of children have grown up throughout the Sure Start era, and there's no particular evidence of a narrowing gap between rich and poor in that cohort. What do you think has gone wrong with Sure Start, and how will that be improved in future?
Well, I think it's too soon to say that things have gone wrong with Sure Start. I think there are things that we can improve about early interventions, particularly making sure that they reach families and individuals who haven't been effectively engaged with children's services and what they have to offer in the past. I think there's been a problem with some people who think that any involvement with the state or any of its agencies will mean that they will be judged, and they see it as a threat rather than a promise of support, and we need to engage with that. But I think that all the evidence, Heckman and others, reinforces the fact that effective early years education can yield benefits later. But I think it's important that we recognise that Sure Start and early years provision should be about child development primarily, and there may have been a tendency amongst some to see it basically as a way of helping adults back into the workforce, fine, but the most important thing is to make sure that children have structured activities, whether it's structured play or introduction to learning in an appropriate environment, that gets those neural connections firing and gets them curious about the world and ready to learn.
I mean, clearly there is brilliant parenting and bad parenting in all groups in society, but there's also, of course, the question of access to opportunities. And it seems that one of the big things driving social mobility is the difference in opportunities after the school bell rings, in the evenings, at weekends and holidays. And we've got the learning loss issue, which is being addressed partly by the Year 6 to Year 7 summer school pilot. What else can be done to equalise the opportunities between the rich and the poor out of school?
I think we've given some thought and are giving some thought to what schools do in terms of extra and co-curricular activities and what the best schools offer. Everything from chess to hockey, from drama to debating. And I think it's important that we encourage those schools that have a commitment to extracurricular activities. But I think this comes back to a question about the burden that we place on teachers. I think that if we're going to ensure that our education system serves children well, we're going to inevitably have to demand more of our school system, and that means looking at teacher workload in order to make sure that we support teachers in the right way. But it also means that we do need to think about longer school days, longer school terms, and within those longer school days and longer school terms, the sorts of activities that I've just mentioned, which help build up a rounded young person who's confident and capable of taking their place as a successful citizen.
Thank you.
Alex.
Do you really believe that academies and free schools should go it alone, or do you favour multi-academy and umbrella trusts, which effectively control, perhaps in much the same way as local authorities, depending on the level of delegation?
Both.
Both, right. What options are open to failing academies and free schools?
If the sponsor's wrong, we'll remove them. And there's an opportunity, as there was, I think, with one particular academy in Southwark, where the local diocese was the sponsor and the diocese wasn't doing a good job. ARC have stepped in to take it over. There are one or two other academies whose sponsors we think are not up to scratch, and in one or two cases the sponsors have taken ameliorative steps to deal with the problems. In one or two cases those sponsors will lose the academies.
So would you force a failing academy or free school into an academy, one of these multi-academy trusts?
Or whatever was the appropriate measure, yes.
So you would do that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
We have in one case already.
I believe very much that children should be able to go to school as near to home as possible, and some groups have promoted free schools on that basis. I'm keen to understand how the department is ensuring that successful schools near to proposed free schools are protected and sustained in places where there are sufficient secondary schools, secondary places at high-performing schools. In other words, there's enough spaces, high-performing schools, why a free school?
If parents want it and if there's demand, then that school, albeit high-performing, may not be high-performing enough.
You've made it clear in the past that free schools could open up in all manner of premises, industrial units, redundant offices and things. What protections are there in place to ensure that we don't rush in order to open a free school and that our children are properly protected?
If only we were rushing to open them at the rate that I'd like to see. The truth is that we had 24 free schools open in last September. They've opened in a variety of buildings. Perhaps Alex, you and I can visit them. They're all very handsome buildings, fit for purpose. There are more than enough rules and regulations about what you can and cannot do in the nation's buildings to ensure that the children are being educated well. One of the striking things, though, is that the Norwich Free School has, I think it cost only about £1 million to convert an already existing office into a really handsome school. And that school has built relationships with other institutions, which means that the children play football at Carrow Road and are educated in a handsome Victorian, may even be Georgian building, and all for far cheaper than a new school would have cost under the last government. My only regret about the whole thing is that the children by playing football at Carrow Road may grow up supporting Ed Balls' favourite team, but you can't have everything.
Okay. Free school teachers, you said, won't need to have teaching qualifications. Don't you think this undermines the importance of what teachers do and suggests perhaps that people without proper training are not really the right people to be teaching our children?
No. Again, there's a new free school, Langley Hall, I think, which has two people who are not qualified as teachers, but who bring skills, creative and practical skills to bear in the education of those children, which parents and the head teacher absolutely believe have augmented what that school can offer. Richard Garner, brilliant journalist in The Independent, wrote a feature outlining the benefits that that flexibility can bring. I'll send a copy to the committee. We know that independent fee-paying schools often take people who are not qualified teachers but have specific skills in specific areas. In my own constituency, the CCF and the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme and a brilliant pipe band are all supported by someone who is not or was not a qualified teacher when he joined. So I think it's important to recognise that the education workforce can draw people from a variety of different backgrounds, but I also agree with you that it's really important that we stress the vital role that strong qualifications play in making sure that the best quality teaching can be provided.
So what's a reasonable proportion of teachers opposed to non-qualified teachers?
It's for the head to decide, not me.
Pardon?
It's for the head to decide, not me.
Right, okay. Free schools and academies take on nearly half the national average of pupils and children with free school meals or from the most deprived backgrounds. And the number of children in academies opened by the government has slumped from 30% under Labour to 5%. That's with children with special educational needs or on free school meals. Does that not demonstrate your policy is more about creating schools independent of local authorities rather than driving up standards and tackling underperformance?
No.
Why not?
Because all those schools that have taken on academy freedoms are engaged in working with or collaborating with other schools in order to help them to raise standards. More broadly, one of the criticisms that have been directed at academies is that over time the number of children in them eligible for free school meals or with special educational needs have diminished. That was often the case, that schools which had previously been viewed as sink schools had become highly successful So the diminution of children who were on free school meals or had special educational needs was a consequence of the school's success, not a cause of the school's success.
Finally, I've just got one, honestly. I very much treasure the King James Bible my gran gave me when I was 6 years of age. Have you got the project that you have to put a King James Bible in every school, have you actually got it funded now? And don't you think the Bible can speak for itself and doesn't really need a forward from you?
Yes, and yes. But I'll say a wee bit more. Firstly, the Guardian, which I would never compare with the King James Bible, had an article the other day which said that we had lots of Bibles in a warehouse in Holland or wherever. The King James Bible facsimiles haven't yet been printed. So by definition, they can't be in a warehouse. I mean, as readers of the King James Bible, both you and I will know that miracles can occur. But how you can have a warehouse filled with things that haven't been created yet. The other thing is that the authors of the King James Bible were a committee of learned divines. I'm neither learned nor divine, and so therefore I've decided that there shouldn't be any other words in the King James Bible other than those that the original authors penned.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much. In engaging pupils, is good, excellent teaching or nature of the subject the primary factor?
Excellent teaching.
We have teacher training schools. Do we need the teacher equivalent of a consultant doctor, teacher status?
Possibly.
Are excluded kids naughty or needy?
Both.
2/3 of writers had SEN. What are we doing about it and what should we be doing about it?
I think it's important when we're talking about special educational needs to disaggregate the different types of challenges that children and young people face. And I think that we should be clear that many of those were children who had behavioural, emotional and social difficulties, and that those were often a consequence of some of the problems that Damien was talking about earlier, very early in their lives. So these are children who do have needs that affect their education, their lives have been blighted, but it will often be as a result of poor parenting, being born in poverty, poor education earlier in their life. So we need to tackle all of those problems together.
What is the government doing to recognise the role of sport in behaviour improvement and behaviour management?
I think that we need to do more to encourage competitive sport, and I'm very glad that more than 50% of schools are taking part in the schools' games, which my colleague Jeremy Hunt has played a visionary role in championing. And I think that one of the most important things about sport is that in the past I think people have stressed the benefits that sport brings in terms of participation to help reduce obesity. Very important. But I also think that sport is critical in terms of building character. And I think in particular that team sport and competitive sport encourages children to collaborate with one another and then to deal with adversity and loss and defeat. As a parent myself, I appreciate that it's children learning how to cope with defeat that helps build their character. And given that my son has become a fan of Queen's Park Rangers, he's learned how to cope with defeat manfully over the course of the last few months.
Thank you. Ian.
Yes, you earlier talked about the importance of working across government, particularly when it comes to the welfare of children. Will your department conduct an impact assessment on the implications for children, their welfare and their education of proposed changes to the benefits system?
I don't know who should conduct that impact assessment. It's a very fair point. I will come back to the committee and let you know where we think that work best be done, whether it's by us, DWP or whoever.
Okay. You also earlier mentioned that local authority spending on children's services had grown. Would you accept that there's been a significant increase in referrals and demand for services in many areas?
Yes, I think it's important to stress that it's grown in some local authority areas and in some subdivisions of local authority budgets. There are other local authorities that face real challenges, but I absolutely acknowledge that referrals have gone up, and I think there are a variety of factors behind that.
Okay. How many primary academies will there be by the end of this Parliament?
I don't know how many there will be. At the moment, we have, in terms of primary academies, some figures here.
Which tell us later. Tell us later.
What? I'll tell you later. I don't know the exact figure that we, but by definition, because it's a demand-led programme.
Yeah.
So what do you expect? Do you have any idea where?
We don't have a target. So, you know, the more who want, the better. What we do have is an expectation that 200 underperforming primaries will become sponsored academies by the end of this calendar year.
Right. Last week, an Ofsted inspector told me that on a recent inspection of a particular school, she observed a very poor lesson. She reported this to the lead inspector, who told her categorically that in this school there is no poor lessons. What will you do to stop this lack of challenge for supposedly good schools?
The new Chief Inspector, I think, has made it clear that he expects the bar to raise at every level. He expects there to be more observation of teaching and learning, and he wants to improve and strengthen the cadre of inspectors. So if you wanted to pass on whatever information you felt appropriate to the Chief Inspector, I know that he would be determined to deal with that problem.
Okay. Do you regret using private email to discuss ministerial business?
This relates to a broader issue about freedom of information, and the approach that I've taken towards freedom of information and the use of email has been governed by two things: the advice that the Permanent Secretary gave to ministers and to advisers, and the advice that the Cabinet Office has given to ministers and advisers, and we've striven at all times to follow that advice.
Okay. Did you ever discuss building schools for the future using private email address?
My recollection is that there will have been times when I will have sent from my home email to my private secretary emails covering a huge variety of issues. But one of the things that I think understandably people misunderstand about government is that you cannot achieve anything in government unless it goes through your private office. So whether or not I'd sent it from a government email or my home email, in order for it to become operationalised, it will have had to have touched down in my private secretary's or in the private office's email accounts when it instantly becomes part of the government process. So everything that relates to decisions about building schools for the future or any other material decision which had the effect of becoming government policy will have gone through those channels.
One of the big challenges with particularly youngsters, some youngsters from deprived backgrounds, is getting them into school, keeping them there and educating them. Have you got any thoughts about how we can continue to improve the process of doing that?
Of keeping them in?
Getting them into school,
yes.
Keeping them there and educating them.
Yes. I don't know if the committee have yet had an opportunity to talk to Charlie Taylor, the government's behaviour advisor.
We took evidence from him,
yes,
but some time ago, before he was in that position.
He'll shortly be publishing a report which deals with attendance and alternative provision, and two of the three areas that you alluded to or mentioned. The report, his report, will deal extensively with. So I'd encourage you to invite him to come along and then talk to ministers afterwards about it. There's always more that we can do, and one of the concerns that I have is that as we raise the participation age, that there are children at 16 and 17 who've previously been allowed to, well, no one's allowed it, but who've previously disengaged from school earlier on, and we need to nip that problem of attendance and engagement in the bud earlier if we're to make sure that raising the participation age helps all the children who it's intended to help. So we do need to look at a variety of levers, and perhaps that means additional powers for schools and local authorities.
And lastly from me, would you welcome an interface between this committee and the Ministerial Advisory Group to oversee the work that they're doing in looking at the future role for local authorities in school improvement?
Totally. This is a great committee, and it does a brilliant job, and the more you can engage with the department and its advisory groups, the better.
Thank you very much.
Tessa.
I wondered how many children you'd like to see in every class. The size of class.
I don't have a view. There are laws on...
I bet you do.
Well, I've got views on so many things. It depends. The critical thing, and it touches on something that Damien said, the critical thing is the quality of the teacher. So, obviously, at infant level, there are laws, quite rightly, that stress that class sizes shouldn't, except in exceptional circumstances, siblings and so on, go above a particular level. Quite right too. I think later on in school, the critical test for me is, are children in a class with a superb teacher? And I would rather, for the sake of argument, that you had one teacher who was brilliant, teaching 16 children, than two groups of 8 with indifferent teaching for those two groups. So the critical question is the quality of teaching.
Yes, but does that mean we can aim for 16 in a class?
Well, I think that it's ultimately, we're constrained inevitably by the resources that we have. All other things being equal, the more individual attention or small group attention that students can have, the better. And one of the striking things about what's happened in academies and in free schools is that you have often seen a move towards better adult, child and teacher pupil ratios as resources have been used more effectively. But I'm conscious of the fact that I don't want to fashion a new stick with which to beat teachers or head teachers, so I don't want to say that I'm going to prescribe something. Teachers themselves will want to teach, if at all possible, smaller classes, but it's important that we don't say that we don't make that the be-all and end-all when teacher quality is so important.
But the comparison is made on the outcome of the pupil. How do you compare somebody who's been taught in a class of 16 from a class of 30? Do we record that information?
Well, we have information on class sizes overall, and there is academic research which shows the impact of class size on pupil attainment. I don't think that we can monitor, though the more data the better as far as I'm concerned, and I will come back to the committee with how granular our information can be.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Why should there be fewer parent governors on an academy governing body?
I just think that there should be fewer governors overall who are doing a tighter job. Can I ask a favour, Mr. Chairman? You very kindly provide me with some water. Will you excuse me for a second? And then I'll come back and carry on answering questions. Could you suspend the sitting for a second? Please, sir. That's right. I'll be back in a minute.
Do we get injury time?
Yes, absolutely. 7-minute stoppage time. Sorry,
coming back. No, that's fine. Can I ask, have you considered policies that make pupils rather than teachers responsible for their own learning?
We're considering at every stage how we can encourage a greater sense of responsibility on the part of pupils for their learning, yes. And one of the things that I think technology provides is an opportunity for children to work more effectively at their own pace and to be stretched in a way that perhaps the teacher may not have anticipated. So yes, but I think it comes back to the question about class size in a way, and it also reflects on one of the points that Alex made. I wouldn't want to do anything that undermined the critical role that teachers can play. They're the most important people in the system, and nothing matters more than the quality of teaching in raising a child's attainment and you know, getting them to succeed later in life.
Okay, fine. When are you going to sort out the problem of student transport and free transport for those who are in compulsory education or training or whatever it is, up to the age of 18, please?
Local authorities are under a statutory obligation to make sure that children can, young people can, by that stage, get to the educational institution that they should.
Sure they can, but in my area it's 795 quid or something if you happen to be in a peculiar catchment area.
It's one of those areas, and it goes back to Ian's point, where the department and the local government have to work together. And
when are they going to do that?
we're seeking to work together at the moment. I don't think there's ever been a perfect answer to the problem of school transport.
Free is a good answer if you're trying to go to school.
Costs.
Okay, fine. Can I ask, how many apprentices does the FE employ?
Do we employ?
Yes.
I don't know.
Could you come back to me on that? Could you also tell me, please, about how many interns you have and how many extended work experience students you have?
Yes, I will.
Thank you very much indeed. Could you ask me, financial education, will that become a key part of the modern curriculum?
We're conducting a review. There are two aspects to financial education, I'd say. One of them is the application of some basic numeracy skills, and we're considering how in our revised programmes of study for mathematics we can include some of those skills that are necessary. The other thing is just common sense, what you might call resilience, and we're looking at the best examples of PSHE across the board in order to try to isolate those schools that do it best and learn lessons from them.
Okay, how many hours a week do you think a teacher should work?
Well, at the moment they're required to work 32.5 hours, of which 10% of time is planning, preparation and assessment time, i.e. not in the classroom. I think that, yeah, that's what it says in law. I think the question is that teachers should work as long as is required to do the job. And I think there's a cultural thing here. If you excuse me taking slightly longer to answer the question. I don't want any more than anyone does to have teachers who are demotivated, exhausted, strung out or burnt out. And I recognise that standing in front of a class, particularly if you're a primary school teacher, throughout the day, takes a lot out of you. Absolutely. But at the same time, I think it's important that we don't have a culture of clock watching. I think it's important that we have a culture of collaborative engagement and team working, where, for example, if you need to cover for an absent colleague who's dealing with family crises, that you have a greater degree of flexibility. I think that there are some in the unions, not all, some in the unions who see advocacy of greater flexibility as an attempt to, you know, essentially make teaching a less attractive destination. I absolutely disagree with that. I think a greater degree of flexibility, collaboration and team working is about making sure that the burden is shared.
Okay. How would you feel if children in your children's class behaved like MPs do at PMQs?
Oh, it's a very good question.
Be quick, because I'm running out of time.
I'll take two things. I think you're absolutely right. People in public positions, MPs, everyone has to think, how does our behaviour reflect on, or how does it reflect on us, and therefore what's the impact on young people. However, one thing I would say is that this will sound pompous, even more pompous than anything I've said so far. Well, it's a high bar I'm setting, I know. I think that there's a slight namby-pamby PC tendency to try to anaesthetise public debate. I think that public debate should be engaged and passionate and raucous. I think it's quite right that at Prime Minister's question time that the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition should feel determined to put across their point of view. I think sometimes we try to emulsify public discourse instead of saying it's a good thing when ideas clash. One of the best safeguards of liberty in this country is the fact that if you are an accused and you're in court, then your defending brief tries everything possible to knock down the prosecuting arguments. I think over time, this place and this chamber has succeeded because just when the executive thinks it's got a good idea, there have been people who've been prepared to stand out against it and to say no and to use every device and every argument at their disposal. So I think when people say, can't we have a sort of hemicycle-style arrangement in the House of Commons like in Strasbourg, my view is absolutely not. That would be the anaesthetisation of democracy. So I like a raucous and rambunctious House of Commons, and if that puts me at odds with the Speaker, then, well, there you go.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Secretary of State. I think you'll find that many men would agree with you, but I think you'll find most women don't. Can I? One of the most popular tweets that we received were from teachers who asked that the Secretary of State would shadow a teacher for a day or perhaps longer. One tweeter, I think a woman, suggested you might wish to stay with her from 5 o'clock in the morning when she gets up until the evening when she finishes her day's work, and that would put you in a better position to formulate policy. Would you commit to doing that?
Depends who the teacher is, but yes.
Okay. Higher education and further education applications have collapsed in this country. And before you tell me that they haven't collapsed across the board, I accept that. I think they've gone up in Oxford and Cambridge, and certainly in my region, the numbers of applications for Durham has increased, but the universities that young people from the region go to have collapsed. When in education, one of the ways in which we check whether a child is actually learning by rote or just or understands is where we say to them, so what do you think would happen next? So when you trebled tuition fees and when you abolished EMA, what did you think would happen next?
There's a distinction between FE and HE. I think if you look at what happens for people who are staying on after the age of 16 and making choices in further education colleges, I think that the number staying on has gone very slightly up, actually. So the feared drop-off as a consequence of reforming educational maintenance allowance doesn't appear to have happened. There are some FE colleges that have recorded drops in enrolment and other FE colleges that have recorded increases. But broadly, in FE, it's risen. In HE, it's a different picture. And I want to have a look at the figures that came out yesterday to analyse them in detail. I haven't had a chance to do so. The evidence suggests that there's been a bigger drop-off amongst mature students and that it depends partly on the quality of institutions and what they offer. One of the things that the higher education reforms were supposed to do is to make students think hard about whether or not it was in their interests to pursue a degree or an apprenticeship or to pursue a career in the world of work rather than going on to university. But I agree with you that it is important once you've introduced a policy to assess how it's operating on the ground. And I also, I think, agree with a number of other people who've expressed a desire to ensure that more students from disadvantaged backgrounds go on to top-performing universities. And by top-performing universities, I don't just mean Durham and Oxbridge. I also mean universities like Newcastle, which have a fantastic record, and other major regional city universities, and also some of the newer universities that used to be polytechnics that have strengths in particular areas. So it's a complex picture. I want to look at all the evidence there, but in FE it's better than you might think.
So Newcastle University, where HE applications have dropped by 7% this year. Moving on to
that worries
premium.
Me. That worries me.
All the evidence that we have seen, and certainly my experience tells me, that early intervention is where we make a real difference. So why aren't we paying the pupil premium at 3? Why are we waiting until children are in compulsory education when we know that it is almost too late?
Well, it comes back to the question of wanting to do more. One of the things that we have done is increase the number of 2-year-olds who have access to preschool learning. I'd like to think, actually, to be fair, that if Labour had won the election, this is something they would have wanted to do. You know, I can't know, but I think, and I hope it's an area where there'll be sort of bipartisan support. You know, we moved from a situation where 20 up to 120 or 140 to 240,000 2-year-olds will benefit from it, and it is targeted at the poorest. As we were discussing earlier, the Pupil Premium is a new policy which I hope will bring benefits, and I think that the anecdotal feedback on the ground reinforces that it is. Let's see, but I wouldn't rule anything out.
So a possibility for the future?
Yes.
Right. Moving on to home-to-school transport. I think that certainly some of us met with the Prime Minister recently to talk about rural bus cuts. And most authorities have cut back significantly on home-to-school and college transport. Some have almost abolished it. What that means is that pupils, parents, students are making decisions on what they can afford and not what they need and what they want in terms of courses. What are you going to do about this?
It worries me. As I said earlier in response to Tessa, there is a statutory obligation on local authorities to make sure that they have an appropriate plan to ensure that young people after the age of 16 can exercise those choices. What you were saying to me and what others have said is that not every local authority is necessarily doing that. Now, I don't want to bash local authorities on this occasion. It may well be that there are specific circumstances, particularly in a big and diverse local authority like Durham or like Somerset. What I'm going to do is work with those local authorities and talk to them about the budgetary pressures that they're under and how we can make sure that more efficiency ensures that choices can be honoured.
Can I just ask one very quick one?
I'm afraid not.
It is really quick.
It's you, Pat.
One of the surprising areas in which we got loads of tweets were about school libraries.
Oh, yeah.
Why are libraries compulsory in prison but not in schools, and what are you going to do about it? See, I thought it was really quick.
It's a very good question. I'm a great fan of school libraries, and I think that we should encourage reading. On the whole, I think that we should have less compulsion when it comes to school buildings, because I think that in the past we've had compulsion about all sorts of stuff. But I think that one of the areas where there is a case for us intervening, I don't think necessarily in compulsion, but I'll think about how we can intervene, is to encourage schools to have libraries. And by libraries, I mean proper libraries with proper books, which encourage wider reading.
Good. Thank you.
Neil.
Thank you. How do we make the teaching profession more attractive to increase people's interest in becoming teachers?
You make it harder to become a teacher.
Fair enough.
And the reason why is that the countries with the best teachers are those countries where teaching is the most prestigious profession, and it's the most prestigious profession because it's the most difficult to get into. In that sense, I think raising the bar on entry is one of the ways in which we reinforce it. And I think concomitant with that, we need to ensure that whether it's through bursaries for high achievers or greater flexibility over salaries and accelerated promotion for people who are doing well, that those who are achieving, and Charles alluded to this earlier, can get more money.
So moving towards a professional body for teachers might be a way forward to encourage them to take charge of their own destiny.
Well, I think that it's important that teachers should think about allying themselves or benefiting from professional associations. And there are several things I would say. Firstly, the best people in the trade unions already aspire to do that. So you've got organisations like ATL or ASCL, which produce material which isn't, I mean, it's quite right they should campaign for improved pensions and all the rest, but that's part of their job. But they also produce material on the curriculum, on professional development. The NUT has an educational journal it publishes with some fascinating stuff in it. That's exactly what they should be doing in order to help raise the prestige of what they do. Also, I think that when we're thinking about teachers, we should end the division between people who work in nurseries, people who work in primary and secondary, people who work in FE, and people who work in higher education. Whether you are a Regius Professor of Hebrew at Christchurch, or you are working with 2-year-olds in Aberdeen, you should be part of one fused profession that sees its job as safeguarding the intellectual life of the nation. And I think it's important that we uphold and support that. Within that, there may be different professional associations that suit the needs of teachers depending on the areas in which they work. But trying to say that, you are just as important a professional if you're working in a preschool setting as you are if you're working in a Russell Group University is important.
Does that logic apply to the Department of Education and the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills?
Well, I think it was wrong to split universities and science away from the Department for Education. But one mustn't make the best the enemy of the good. And at the moment, we have a superb team of ministers in biz who are doing a brilliant job. So I've got enough to get on with at the moment.
Absolutely. How are we going to encourage federalism in schools, between schools, academies and so forth? And do you wish to do that anyway?
Yeah, I think collaboration is absolutely a good thing, and we've been discussing how we might further incentivise collaboration. The existence of teaching schools, the role the National College plays, the growth of academy sponsorship and networks is all part of that. And I've been struck by the fact that you've got some schools. I mean, one of my favourites, Altrincham Girls Grammar School, is playing a part in East Manchester in helping to raise attainment, thereby creating a federation of primary and secondary schools working with the grammar. And you've got the perfect model there of a school that is outstanding, that could merely keep to itself if it wanted to, and look after the children who go to school past the well-tended lawns of the most salubrious part of Greater Manchester. But that school's head teacher is determined to extend her mission beyond simply Altrincham, and I think that's a great model, and it's striking that there are more and more head teachers who are doing that from high-performing state schools. My concern is that that sort of fantastic leadership that we're seeing from the best teachers in the state sector, we're not seeing from some independent fee-paying schools. And I think it's a shame that schools which are the envy of the world in the fee-paying independent sector are not doing enough to extend their mission beyond their well-tended lawns.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's it.
I've got one more question, which is, what are you going to do to simplify Section 251 for the conversion of academies, which is causing difficulties in Gloucestershire?
It's causing difficulties everywhere, and we are talking to local government at the moment about simplifying the whole process of working out how local authorities and schools should have money fairly divided between them.
Excellent. Lisa.
Have you or your advisors ever used private email accounts in order to conceal information from civil servants or the public?
We've always followed the advice that the Cabinet Office have laid down on freedom of information.
Have you ever used private email accounts in order to conceal information from civil servants or the public, you or your advisors?
Well, sometimes I've sent emails on my private account to my wife, for example, about whether or not we might go to the theatre. And on the whole, I would have thought that that would have been something that, while the civil servants or the public might have been interested in it, it wouldn't necessarily have been an appropriate matter to share.
Have you or your advisors ever used private email accounts in order to conceal information from civil servants or the public that relates to departmental business and is covered by the Freedom of Information Act?
Well, there are many different interpretations of how the Freedom of Information Act might apply, and I've always followed the advice that I've received from the Cabinet Office.
Can I understand that the answer to that, then, Secretary of State, is yes?
No, the answer is the answer that I gave.
So the answer is not no and not yes?
Well, the answer is the answer I gave. I think it's important when we're looking at freedom of information to appreciate a variety of things. Firstly, as I said in response, I think, to Ian's question, if you're talking about departmental business, then departmental business can only be conducted by engaging with departmental officials and by asking them to perform departmental functions. It can be the case that I, as an individual, can have all sorts of conversations with all sorts of people. Those conversations can be private, they can be political, and I think it's incumbent on me to follow the advice that I receive from the Cabinet Office and from the Permanent Secretary about what to do.
In May last year, the Chief Freedom of Information Officer for the Department for Education confirmed to the Permanent Secretary that the Act covered private email accounts. Why wasn't information that was subsequently circulated on private email accounts and covered by the Freedom of Information Act then kept?
We followed the advice that we received from the Cabinet Office about what was and what was not in scope. We asked explicitly, the Department asked explicitly for advice from the Cabinet Office, and that was the advice that we followed. Regrettable.
Why did the Chief Freedom of Information Act officer provide advice that was contrary to the advice provided by the Cabinet Office?
I don't know. One of the things I've found in government is that you will often find that there are different people who will have different interpretations of how things should be followed.
Did you receive that advice and choose to ignore it?
I never ignore any advice that I receive from officials. I might disagree with aspects of that advice and challenge it.
So you subsequently chose to go to the Cabinet Office for further advice after receiving advice from your own department's Chief Freedom of Information Act?
I don't recall seeing that advice from the Chief Freedom of Information Officer myself. Others in the department undoubtedly would have done. It was subsequently made available to all of us.
Have you asked the Permanent Secretary why he didn't pass on that advice to you?
I've asked the Permanent Secretary, both the immediately departed Permanent Secretary and our new one, all sorts of questions about this matter. One thing I would say, though, is that in one newspaper, an email or details of an email appeared. That email was a political conversation. But more than that, my understanding is that it's the job of the Information Commissioner to protect individual data. The department has been on the receiving end of leaked stories that rely on information that would appear to me to have been obtained in a way which was, how can I put this, not consistent with respect for individuals' privacy or individuals' data. It's part of life and part of government that leaks occur, but I think it's also appropriate that the department does its best in order to ensure that there is a confidential space for policy discussion. I think it's also worth recording that the Department for Education has published more data about school performance, more data about expenditure, more data about decisions taken in the last 2 years than it had hitherto. On that basis, we have, and I applaud civil servants for doing so, shown a commitment to making sure that the public and others have as much information as possible about how we act in their name.
In the name of more information, have you ever directed your civil servants not to respond to FOI requests on specific issues? A simple yes or no would be fine.
Have I ever
directed your civil servants not to respond to FOI requests on specific issues?
I've always argued that we should respond to freedom of information requests in an appropriate fashion.
So you've never directed your civil servants not to respond to FOI requests on specific...
I may have said that something would not have been within the scope of a freedom of information
but
request.
You've never told a civil servant not to respond to an FOI request where that request was within the scope of the Freedom of Information Act?
I will have said at certain times that I didn't believe that a freedom of information request would have been within scope, and I would have subsequently taken advice. I will have said at certain points that I thought that certain inquiries might have been vexatious, irresponsible, or whatever, but there are protocols which ensure that if it's appropriate and if an inquiry is in scope, that the rules are followed. So at every time the rule would have been followed, I will have expressed an opinion. If that opinion had to be reviewed subsequently because of advice that I was given by civil servants, it will have been. There will have been a number of conversations in which I will have said, I don't believe that that should be in scope, or I don't believe that this should be in scope. I will have expressed an opinion about the operation of the law, but the law is the law. And in the end, we, like everyone else, have to respect it, whether or not it's applied in a way that I would think was wrong.
When the Financial Times requested documents circulated on private email accounts under the FOI Act, they were told that those documents didn't exist. They've since obtained those documents. Following this, I asked a parliamentary question to discover what actions had been taken to prevent the deletion of information that may be subject to the Freedom of Information Act that was circulated on private email accounts. I'm afraid I did not get an answer. Could you tell us that answer today?
You might not have had an answer that you deemed to be satisfactory, but I'm sure you would have received an answer. The 2 points I would make. The first is that you say that the Financial Times asked for information and then they subsequently received that information. I suspect actually that the Financial Times already had that information, and we were in the curious position of the Financial Times making a freedom of information request to see something that it already had. Why would they do that? Why would they ask to see a document?
Could you answer my question? What steps have you taken to prevent the deletion of information held or circulated on private email accounts that is subject to the Freedom of Information Act?
Well, the advice that we'd received from the Cabinet Office was that anything that was held on private email accounts was not subject to Freedom of Information requests.
We have received differing advice from the Information Commissioner.
Yes.
So can you tell me what steps
you have
taken to prevent information being deleted that is covered by the Freedom of Information Act?
We have received a view from the Information Commissioner. I'm waiting for the Cabinet Office to give us our updated guidance in the light of what the Information Commissioner says. In the meantime, we've chosen to act in accordance with the guidance that we received from the Cabinet Office.
Thank you.
Craig.
Thank you. Calder High School and Todmorden High School, both schools in the Calder Valley that have incredibly poor fabric buildings. Both waiting on tenterhooks for announcements on the priority school building programme. As asked in a tweet, can you afford to delay the priority school building programme announcement considering the urgent need for more places, and when are you going to announce?
We hope to announce after the February constituency recess which schools will benefit from the priority school building programme. And at the moment we're making sure that the significant number of schools that have applied are judged against each other, so that we can, if not guarantee, at least do everything in our power to ensure that those schools that benefit are the most deserving.
Okay. F1 in Schools is a not-for-profit organisation, grasped in over 30 other countries. So many educational attainment, particularly in the STEM area, world headquarters in the Calder Valley. MD can't get past your gatekeepers to have a meeting with you to explain the many benefits of it. Will you see them?
You have got past those gatekeepers brilliantly, Craig, and of course I shall.
When?
I hope that we can fix up later today a firm date. I'm sure at the earliest possible opportunity, but I suspect it may not be until after the constituency recess as well. So it'll be a busy week for news in Calder Valley, later in February or early in March.
Thank you very much. The Minister for Schools spoke recently about researching a mastery level, but he said, and I quote, this would require a huge change of culture. Does this put you off implementing the mastery level?
No, it doesn't. I think it's a challenge because, I mean, again, for the benefit of the committee, all of whom I'm sure are familiar with the arguments, but just to sort of restate. At the moment, the system that we have of reaching an expected level acknowledges that there will be children who will leave school below that level. Moving towards a mastery model means that you don't accept that there are children who can leave primary school without having reached an accepted level of literacy and numeracy. I think that is the right approach to take, but given the, as we all know, the statistical gap between what's expected and what's achieved at the moment, it is a big request of the school system. And so we need to ask, even as we move towards that goal, and we should be determined to move towards that goal, are we doing so in a way which is asking more demands of the school system, but demands which are capable of being met realistically? And therefore it's about timing, and it's also about support for schools as we move towards a different approach towards judging how well people have grasped the curriculum's essentials.
Okay, thank you. One more question from me. The Green Paper on SEN talks about steps to improve initial teacher training for teachers in special schools.
Yes.
The head teacher at Ravenscliffe, which is in Calderdale, has grave concerns about recruitment of specialist teachers in this area because of the lack of a focus in special training for those teachers in initial teacher training. Will this change?
I hope so, yes. And I'll report back to you, Craig, and the committee on how we intend to do that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary of State. I'll end with a final tweet. If you could be any James Bond villain, which one would you be?
Gosh! I think I would be Hugo Drax. And I think the reason I would choose that is A, my enormous admiration for the Member of Parliament for South Dorset, who's got the same surname. But also, I think wasn't it Hugo Drax who was responsible for the rocket in Moonraker? Is that right? And the parliamentary clerk is nodding.
Despite asking the question, I have no idea.
I think Scaramanga had an interest in ballistics, but I think that having an interest in rocket science is probably more appropriate. But I would say that if the committee has any other suggestions about which...
Your advisors seem to want you to stop speaking.
I'm sure they do. Some things never change. But no, I would hate to be Scaramanga. I'd hate to be Dr. No. So I think I'll probably settle for Hugo Drax. One final thing I should say, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for this session. And I'm very happy to come back at any point. There are a number of areas where you ask questions where I promised to come back to the committee. And, for example, there were some questions around local authority funding, and I talked then about general trends. What I may do, with your permission, is write back to the committee in any areas where any of the answers that I gave could be better elucidated by correspondence, data, and further information. And if after having sent that information you'd like me to come back to expand on any of those points, then I would, of course, be absolutely delighted to at your disposal.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary of State. I noticed a tweet during the session said, whatever you think of his policies, you've got to say he does get his message over with well articulated and with wit. So thank you very much for appearing before us today.
Not at all. Thank you.